I'm very, very honoured indeed to be a speaker at the conference. I was due to come out to Pakistan for the conference itself. Unfortunately, work pressures at the university, unexpected work pressures 2 or 3 weeks ago, made that impossible. And I am really very, very disappointed not to be there in the room with you all. I'm also very honoured indeed, I have to say, to be invited to give this presentation. It's an extraordinary honour as far as I'm concerned to be able to come to you remotely in this way and to say a few things about the maritime strategic environment as I put on that first slide, from mare liberum to mare legitimum. But a number of slides which I've put together especially for the conference so that people will be able to see what the thesis is behind what I'm saying. If I were to say everything that's on the slides, it would take me a lot longer than the 15 minutes that I've been allocated. So I will rush through the slides. Anybody who wants them can have them. And anybody who wants to continue the conversation with me can clearly get in touch with me by email. My email address is on that first slide. Okay, what I'm going, you've heard my background. I'm a former Royal Navy officer. A couple of decades ago, I retired from our Ministry of Defence and went into the academic world. I'd been an academic also before that, but I spent a number of years on law enforcement operations at sea. But more recently, as an academic, I focused increasingly on maritime affairs, ocean government affairs, governance affairs, and I have a particular interest in the issue of human rights at sea. But I regard my career, both naval and academic, as merging into a 50-year maritime career, really. I've been involved one way or another with the sea since 1971. What I'm going to be talking about is what I believe is, and it's very interesting that President Macron was quoted in saying the end of 300 years of global Western hegemony, because I would not disagree with him at all on that particular view. It is my contention that there was a period of about 350 years of Western maritime dominance from the early 17th century right the way through to the middle of the 20th century. But the circumstances in maritime terms since then have been changing very, very dramatically. And it's what I call the end of the Grotian era, Grotian being the Dutch philosopher who posited the thesis of free seas, mare liberum, in a publication back in 1609. As far as I'm concerned, this is something that we now need to put a very, very significant question mark against. As I've said on that first slide, the era of maritime imperial rivalry and European expansion is over. And it's been over now for over half a century, as far as I'm concerned. I look at things in a historical perspective, and I certainly see that there is this massive shift away from European interests and North American interests, of course, as well. That period of 350 years between the early 17th century and the middle of the 20th century was a significant era in maritime affairs and indeed a significant era in global affairs. But we're having to look at what is going on and what has been going on since the middle of the 20th century. And it is my belief, and I've looked at a whole raft of things, which I'll explain in the next few minutes. It seems to me that we are experiencing profound change such that the old notion of mare liberum, free seas, has got to be questioned very seriously because it is not serving us well given the major challenges we've got to focus on. And as others have already said, the global maritime environment is a very, very important and indeed crucial part of the world's environment that we need to take care of. I tend to look at that change since 1945. I choose 1945, 1950. Yes, of course, it was the end of the Second World War, which was the last, as far as I'm concerned as a historian, the last of the maritime imperial wars. Now, it's obviously there were great, massive land components to that war, but as far as I'm concerned, that was the last time that major global maritime war occurred. So from the 1950s onwards, I'm analyzing the ocean environment, and I'm analyzing it under 8 different headings. And you see those headings there: the political heading, the economic, the institutional, the social, technological, physical, security, and normative. And I'm going to run through these very quickly. I'm not going to be able to say everything that's going on in these dimensions, merely to stress very much that the change has been massive. It's profound, and it's going in a direction that makes certain ways of looking at the oceans in the past entirely inappropriate. And I must say, and I'll admit to this audience certainly, that as a naval officer from the Royal Navy, I was for many years quite convinced that free seas was a very important way of looking at the oceans, but I've changed my mind, and I'm not very popular amongst my British and US naval colleagues for saying that sort of thing, because both of my Navy and the United States Navy stress frequently the importance of free seas. Well, I'm raising a serious question mark against that notion of free seas, and I'm doing so for these 8-dimensional reasons. As I've said, there's a whole string of bullet points on these slides that are coming up that I can't possibly go through. But we are in a fundamentally different political situation in the 21st century from the situation that we were in up until the middle of the 20th century and slightly later. The economic dimension, well, that's what this conference is also focusing on. As you've seen, there a 6-fold increase in maritime trade since the 1950s, most carried now in very, very large merchant ships, tankers, container vessels. The issue of convenience flags or open registries is an issue. Threats to the sustainability of global fish stocks, and I worked for 3 years as a British Sea Fisheries officer, so I have a practical understanding of the issues to do with fisheries enforcement. The development of continental shelf, mineral and gas exploration, and as has already been commented on, Pakistan's continental shelf is a very important part of your concern for the maritime environment. The realization that increased resource exploitation leads to scarcity, and the drive for some measure of ownership or responsible governance of the oceans is really very, very important indeed. The next dimension that is the institutional one. And of course, the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years has been about the United Nations system, the proliferation of independent states that formed out of the disintegrating European maritime empires. Very, very important. It's led to a 3 to 4 times increase in the number of states. In the 1940s, it was just over 50 states in the United Nations. It's now 193. And those developing states were already signifying their significance and their influence during the Law of the Sea negotiations in the 1970s, 1980s, under the sort of heading of the Group of 77. The final dimension, the final dimensional institutional dimension is the development of governmental organizations, global, regional, and sectoral, and also the increase in the number of non-governmental organizations that are taking an interest in the sea. And my own Human Rights at Sea is but one of them. And that leads me on to the social dimension. This is the one that I'm particularly passionate about these days as a trustee of Human Rights at Sea. When I tell people in these sorts of lectures that the population of the oceans, as I am speaking, is around 30 million people, they look at me as though I'm going mad. But that is a fact. Merchant seafarers are a minority, in fact. There are about 1.5 million of them, just more than that. The bulk of those mariners out there at sea, as I'm speaking, are fishers. But you've also got massive cruise ships. You've got luxury yachts, over 9,000 luxury yachts these days. Ferries, naval and other public vessels, offshore oil and gas industry workers, migrants, both regular and irregular, and of course, very important not to forget, the maritime criminals who are taking advantage of the maritime environment. The technological dimension is also crucially important, and most of the change that has happened has got technology behind it. Development in ocean resource exploitation, for example, is down to technology. Advances in technology for monitoring activities at sea, improvements and advances in ship technology. I was saying to somebody just a couple of days ago that although I'm getting elderly, I'm 70 now, I don't believe it impossible that I will see entirely autonomous major size merchant ships making passage from the east to Europe in that container trade or something similar before I finally leave this world. Advances in communications technology, reducing but not yet entirely ending the remote nature of the oceans. We are becoming less sea blind by technology. The physical dimension is all about things like changing climate, about the strategic consequences of the warming effects in my region in Northern Europe. Of course, we're very concerned about the Arctic, but the Arctic has also got consequences for what happens in the Indian Ocean. Dealing with environmental issues, including ocean warming, ocean level changes, marine pollution, that's already been mentioned today, and I'm sure will be mentioned time and time again in the next 3 days. There's a security dimension, and that, of course, as a former naval person involved in maritime law enforcement, I'm seriously interested in as well. Very much increase in trafficking of arms, drugs, and people by sea, need to ensure much greater measure of human security. Those 30 million people at sea need to be protected. A disturbing increase in slavery at sea. You know, some people think that slavery has disappeared, but it hasn't. It is rife in certain sectors at sea today, and nobody is doing anything seriously to prevent it, to stop it, and to punish those who are guilty of it. Obviously, piracy and armed robbery at sea, you in the Indian Ocean are very familiar with as a result of Somali piracy, not so very long ago and continuing. Perceived threat from terrorism at sea, the threat of low-level maritime disputes leading to action crossing the threshold from law enforcement circumstances to conflict at sea. And although major war has not been a major feature since 1945, and I do stress that as a naval officer, we have not seen a major naval war. There have been smaller naval wars, but not any global major naval war since 1945. And that, to my mind, is massively significant because I believe most of those major wars were a feature of the maritime imperial era, which I now see as being well and truly over. The normative dimension, well, I'm an international lawyer. Of course, I'm interested in the law of the sea and how that has changed.
Professor,
and obviously
may I please request you to conclude? I'm thoroughly enjoying your presentation, but we have a time constraint. So if you could kindly conclude.
I am sorry, I thought I had 15 minutes to speak, but I will wrap up. But you're getting the message, I hope, that the change in the ocean environment, which has been going on the last 60, 70 years, has been quite significant. What are the future? I can't predict the future. There's clearly a need to address the whole issue of jurisdiction at sea, a need to move away, as far as I'm concerned, from the notion of exclusive flag state jurisdiction, a need for significant international agreement. That seems to me to be remote at the moment. But I must say that if we look forward 50 years, we need to have a significant change of attitude towards ocean governance. And that is my basic thesis. We need to move from mare liberum, the notion of free seas, famously articulated by Grotius, to something new, and it's what I call mare legitimum. That is to say, we need an ocean space that is well regulated, and it's a safe and secure space for all of those who are working and operating legitimately at sea, for them to work in safety and to take responsible advantage of the oceans globally. So basically the thesis is that so much change since the middle of the 20th century that we simply cannot ignore. But unfortunately, I find so many people look back on the conditions before, and they are not considering seriously the profound changes in all of those dimensions of the ocean environment in the last 60, 70 years. And I will stop there in order to keep you going on time, but I could talk about this all day, and my 15 minutes is now up, as Dr. Bakai has pointed out, and I don't want to incur her displeasure. Thank you very much indeed.